On a chain of low, marshy islands off the coast of Carolina and Georgia, a people did something almost no one else in America managed to do. When the rest of the enslaved were being stripped of their languages, their names, their gods, and every thread that tied them to home, this one community held on. They kept the words, they kept the food and the songs and the burial rites. They kept, it turns out, more of Africa itself, written into their very ancestry than any other black community in the United States. Their name is the Gullah Geechee, and DNA can now show in hard numbers exactly how much of the homeland they managed to hold on to and reveal the strange, dark, and deeply brutal reason they were able to hold on to it at all, when no one else could. It is not the reason you would guess, and it turns the whole story of these islands inside out. Let's ground this in the science, because for once the genetics and the history and the language all say the same thing, and they say it loudly and in unison. In 2021, a team of researchers published a study called The Genetic Landscape of Gullah African Americans, comparing the DNA of the Gullah against other African American populations, against reference groups from across Africa and Europe, and against people living today in Sierra Leone. Earlier genetic work on the Sea Island communities going back decades, more recent studies of their maternal lineages, and a long tradition of linguistic and historical research by scholars like Lorenzo Dow Turner and Joseph Opala all point in the very same direction. And what they found is genuinely remarkable. Of all the African American communities that have ever been studied in this way, the Gullah carry the most African ancestry and the least European admixture of any of them. The history has suspected it for a century. The DNA confirmed it. But before we get to the numbers, I have to be careful with the words, because the way this story usually gets told is wrong in a way that actually matters. You will hear people call the Gullah the purest African bloodline in America. Set that word down and leave it there. There is no such thing as a pure bloodline in any people anywhere on the face of the earth. It is a fiction invented by race science to rank human beings, and it has never described reality. And the Gullah themselves are not one pure anything. They are a rich and deliberate blend of many different African peoples, brought together on these islands from all across West and Central Africa. The real story was never about purity. It is about preservation. It is about a single community that managed to keep more of Africa alive in their culture and in their very ancestry than anyone believed was still possible on the far side of slavery. And that is a far more astonishing thing than purity could ever be, because purity is an accident of isolation, while what the Gullah did was hold on. So let's look at what the DNA actually shows, because the numbers are striking. Most African American communities, when you measure their ancestry, carry a substantial share of European ancestry mixed in, typically somewhere between 18 and 24%. Their accumulated genetic legacy of generations under a system that gave enslaved women no power over their own bodies. It is a normal, expected, and painful part of the African American genome. But when researchers measured the Gullah of the Sea Islands, they found something completely different. In the most isolated island communities, the European admixture drops to as little as 3 to 6%. Let that number land for a moment. Where a typical African American might carry roughly a fifth of their ancestry from Europe, a Sea Island Gullah person might carry only a 20th, or even less than that. Their genome is overwhelmingly, powerfully, measurably African, to a degree found almost nowhere else in the entire country. When researchers ran a principal component analysis, a way of plotting genetic similarities so that related groups cluster together, the Gullah pulled visibly apart from other African American cohorts, sitting closer to Africa itself. And it shows up just as sharply in the maternal line, maybe even more so, when researchers looked at mitochondrial DNA, the piece passed down from a mother to all her children, straight down the female line, unbroken. They found that around 94% of Gullah participants carried an African maternal lineage, one of the deep African L haplogroups that trace back to the continent. Among other African Americans, the figure was high too, around 89%. But here's the striking part. the maternal lineages associated with European or Native American ancestry, which show up at low but real levels in other African American groups, were essentially absent from the Gullah cohort altogether. Their mothers' mothers' mothers, back and back through the generations, were African, very nearly without a single exception. However you choose to measure it, total ancestry, the strict maternal line, the raw genetic distance from the populations of West Africa, the Gullah come out again and again as the community that held on to the most. So here is the first great question, and its answer is the dark, strange heart of this whole story. How? How did one community, inside the same brutal system that erased everyone else's African inheritance, manage to keep so much of theirs? The answer is isolation, but the reason they were isolated is the part that will stop you cold. It was disease. The Low Country and the Sea Islands, where the great rice plantations were built, were among the wealthiest places in all of colonial America, and among the deadliest. The rice was grown in flooded fields and tidal swamps, an engineered landscape of standing water and dense marsh that was a perfect breeding ground for the mosquitoes carrying malaria and yellow fever. For Europeans, that environment was simply lethal. White planters and their families sickened and died in the swamps at terrifying rates, especially in the hot, wet months from spring through fall when the fevers ran wild. There was a grim saying about the region, that it was, in the summer, a paradise in spring, and a hospital in summer, and a grave in autumn. And so, to survive, the white owners largely fled. They became absentee planters, keeping townhouses in Charleston or Savannah, or estates up north, visiting their island plantations as little as they possibly could, and abandoning them almost entirely during the sickly season, leaving behind a few overseers, and overwhelmingly leaving the enslaved to themselves. Now put the pieces together, because this is the terrible irony sitting at the very center of Gullah history. The enslaved Africans of the Rice Coast carried, through generations of exposure, a degree of inherited resistance to malaria that the Europeans did not, which is part of the coldly calculated reason they were targeted for this specific labor in the first place. So on these islands, you had an enormous, concentrated population of enslaved Africans on many plantations outnumbering the whites by 10 or 20 to 1, living in a strange and painful kind of separation from white society because white society was too frightened of the fever to come and stand over them. The very things that made the Sea Islands a hell of forced labor and early death, the isolation, the disease, the absentee owners, the sheer crushing numbers worked in the mud were the same things that gave the people there the room to hold on to their languages, their names, their customs, their spiritual life, and to marry and raise children among themselves, generation after generation, with little outside interference. The culture survived precisely because the oppressor kept his distance. Africa was preserved in the one place too deadly for the men who had stolen these people from it to be bothered to go. And the DNA carries the fingerprint of that separation with real precision, including one detail that refuses to let the story become too clean. Ancestry testing works by comparing your genome against reference populations and estimating how much of your DNA traces to each part of the world, a process of measuring admixture, the blending of ancestry that piles up over generations. In the Gullah, that measurement comes back overwhelmingly African, because for generation after generation, the community was reproducing largely within itself. On islands, the outside world was afraid to enter, with far less of the forced and coerced mixing that marked plantation life on the mainland. But the researchers found something sobering, hidden inside even that small European fraction, and it is important not to look away from it. It was what geneticists call male bias. That means the European ancestry the Gullah do carry entered the population overwhelmingly through European men, and almost never through European women. And that asymmetry has only one real explanation. It is the genetic signature, here exactly as everywhere else across the diaspora, of white men fathering children with enslaved women who had no power on earth to refuse them. The pattern is written into the chromosomes. European ancestry arriving down the male line, generation after generation, never balanced by European women marrying in, because that is not what was happening. So even in the one community that kept the very most of Africa, that thin 3 or 6% of European ancestry is not a story of unions between equals. It is a quiet, permanent record of the same violence that runs through the entire history of American slavery. The Gullah kept more than anyone alive, but no one who was enslaved got to keep everything, and the DNA does not let us pretend for even a moment otherwise. Now for the part that turns this from a story about isolation into a story about a specific, findable homeland, because the Gullah did not just keep Africa in the abstract. They kept a particular corner of it. The enslaved people brought to the Carolina and Georgia coast were not a random sample of the continent. They were selected deliberately with a specific skill in mind. Rice was the crop that made the Low Country one of the richest places in the Americas, and rice is not simple agriculture. It is difficult, highly skilled work demanding sophisticated knowledge of water, tides, soil, and irrigation, and there was a region of West Africa, the so-called Rice Coast, stretching through what is now Sierra Leone, Guinea, and their neighbors, where people had been cultivating rice with exactly those sophisticated techniques for centuries, building dikes and sluices, and managing flooded fields long before any European arrived. So Carolina planters deliberately sought out and paid premium prices for captives from that particular region for the expertise carried in their heads and their hands. Many of them passed through a notorious slave castle called Bunce Island, sitting in a river in Sierra Leone, and were carried directly from there to the auction blocks of Charleston. The knowledge stolen with those people quite literally built the plantations and generated the fortunes. And the genetics remember it. The Gullah show a measurably closer genetic relationship to the people of present-day Sierra Leone than other African American groups do, even as they remain related, like all people of African descent in the Americas, to many different West African populations. But the proof is not only in the genes, it is in the mouth and in the memory. In the 1940s, the pioneering linguist Lorenzo Dow Turner recorded the Gullah language and painstakingly documented thousands of African words, personal names, and grammatical structures woven all through it, proving that Gullah was not broken English, as racists had long dismissed it, but a genuine Creole language carrying Africa in every sentence. Decades later, the historian Joseph Opala traced the connection directly back to Sierra Leone, matching Gullah songs, words, rice farming practices, and even a specific funeral chant to living traditions still practiced there. In one almost unbelievable case, a Gullah family had passed down a song, syllable by syllable, for generations without knowing what the words meant. And it turned out to be a man funeral song, still sung in a village in Chamatur, Sierra Leone, preserved perfectly across 2 centuries and an ocean by people who had guarded it without even knowing its meaning. Since then, Gullah families have made the journey back across the water in homecomings and reunions that have brought Gullah descendants and Sierra Leoneans together, weeping in recognition. The same rice, the same words, the same rhythms, the same faces, meeting again after 200 years apart. And it is not only in the language, it is in the hands and the daily life. The famous Gullah sweetgrass baskets, coiled in a technique brought directly from the Rice Coast, were originally the fanner baskets used to winnow rice, the exact craft carried across the Atlantic in living memory. It is in the ring shout, the counterclockwise sacred dance and song that preserved West African worship inside the shell of Christianity. It is in the food, the rice at the center of every table, the okra, the gumbo, the dishes with African roots and African names. It is in the folk tales of Br'er Rabbit, descended straight from African trickster tales. A whole way of being, carried across the water intact. The thread was stretched almost to the point of breaking, but it was never fully cut. And the Gullah are still, to this day, holding the far end of it in their hands. Quick pause. Because recovering exactly this kind of true, documented, powerful history, without the myths, without the pseudoscience, and without the cheap flattery that fills so much of the internet on this subject, is the entire reason this channel exists. The real story of the Gullah is more extraordinary than any legend anyone could invent, and it does not need dressing up in borrowed finery to be worth your time. It only needs to be told straight. If that is the work you want more of, the honest version that actually holds up, subscribe and stay with me. Because now I have to be very careful and very precise, since the truth here has to be handled honestly, or it curdles into something it should never, ever become. Something that turns a story of survival into a story of superiority. This is the part that matters most, so let me be exact. First, and I said it at the start, but it genuinely bears repeating, this is not a story about racial purity, and it must never, ever be told as one. The Gullah are not a pure people, because no people on earth is, and the phrase itself belongs to the ugly vocabulary of race science, which has only ever been used to rank human beings and to justify harming them. What the DNA shows is not purity, it is retention, an unusually high proportion of African ancestry preserved by isolation. Nothing more mystical than that, and even that retention is of something thoroughly mixed. The Gullah are themselves an amalgamation of many different African ethnic groups from all across West and Central Africa, brought together on these shores by the indiscriminate machinery of the slave trade and blended over generations into something genuinely new. They are not one African tribe kept intact in a jar. They are a whole mosaic of Africa, made of 100 broken pieces, kept unusually whole. Second, this does not make the Gullah more African or more authentic or more real than any other Black American, and that framing does genuine, lasting damage. Every African American carries a deep, undeniable, unbreakable African inheritance, whatever their admixture happens to be. The Gullah are not a different, higher category of Blackness. They are one branch of the very same tree, one that happened through a specific and painful accident of history to keep more of its leaves through a long winter. A person with more European admixture is not less African in any way that matters. The number is an artifact of history, not a measure of worth or belonging. In fact, researchers increasingly see the Gullah as something like a genetic and cultural reference point for African Americans broadly, a living window onto what much of the wider community descended from before the greater mixing of the mainland. Their story sits at the root of the family and belongs to all of it, not above it. Third, the science itself is careful and still growing. These are relative differences, drawn from studies with modest sample sizes, measuring how the Gullah compare with other groups, not absolute pronouncements. And the isolation that preserved so much was never for one moment idyllic. It came bound up with brutal forced labor, with deadly disease, and in the generations since emancipation, with relentless pressure on Gullah land, resort developers, rising property taxes, and legal maneuvers steadily stripping away the very islands that made the culture possible in the first place. The shelter that saved them is now being sold out from under them, acre by acre, even as the world finally learns to value what they kept. What survives every caveat is the true and remarkable core. The Gullah kept more of Africa, its language, its culture, and its ancestry than any other community in America. And the DNA now proves it. So let's bring it home, because what the Gullah preserved belongs to far more than one string of islands. Think hard about what was actually done to the enslaved. The entire machinery of slavery was designed, among all its other cruelties, to erase where people came from, to sever the language, scatter the families across auction blocks, forbid the drum, ban the old religions, strip away the names, and cut the thread back to the homeland until within a few generations, the memory itself was simply gone. And it very nearly worked. It worked to a devastating degree, almost everywhere the system reached, except of all places on these low and fever-ridden islands, on the sea islands, protected by the very fevers that made the place a graveyard for their captors. One community slipped through the erasure and carried Africa across 2 full centuries very nearly intact, not perfectly, not untouched, never that, but far more whole than anyone else on the continent managed to keep it. The Gullah did not keep a pure bloodline, and they would not want you to say they did. They kept something better and truer and much harder to destroy. A living bridge. A language you can still hear spoken on a porch in Beaufort County today. Songs you can still trace, note for note, to the specific villages they came from. An ancestry that still runs, overwhelmingly and undeniably, straight back to the rice coast of West Africa. That is what the DNA really reveals, and what it refuses to say. It does not say the Gullah are purer than other Black Americans, because they are not. And the idea is a trap that turns a beautiful history into an ugly hierarchy. What it says is this: when almost every enslaved person in America was forced to let go of the homeland, the Gullah, alone among them, managed to keep their grip on it. And the reason they could was the same brutal isolation that made their islands a place of suffering and death. They took the instrument of their imprisonment and turned it into the shelter that saved their inheritance. And because they held on so tightly for so long, the rest of Black America now has something close to priceless. A place to look, a thread to follow, a living, breathing proof of exactly how much of Africa actually survived the crossing. The Gullah kept more of Africa than anyone in America. And in keeping it so fiercely for themselves, they ended up keeping it for everyone. Next time, we finally cross the water on the very thread the Gullah never let go of. To the rice coast of West Africa itself, to Sierra Leone and the sophisticated civilizations that farmed that shore for centuries before the ships came, and then down the coast to the great kingdom of the Congo, to see the homelands that the DNA of Black America keeps pointing back toward again and again. The Gullah did the hardest thing. They kept the bridge standing across 200 years in an ocean when everyone else's was burned. Now let's walk across it together and see what was waiting on the far side all along, the world these people were taken from, and the civilization the history books never told you was there. Subscribe, and we'll follow it home together.